Thank you for joining me in session 7 of the study of Luke, the Explore the Bible series. The text is Luke chapter 22, verses 54 to 62. The title is Denied, and the lesson summary statement is Denying Jesus Leads to Sorrow and Guilt. Sometimes when you're teaching a lesson, you understand and you can feel the power of the lesson. It grips you. But you have difficulty getting a hold of it in order to teach it and share it with your class. Occasionally, once in a blue moon, I will share that with a class, and then I will say to the class, I need you to really participate and help me with this lesson. I try not to do that very often. My responsibility is to come prepared. But I occasionally, when I have struggles with a lesson, I will do that. And then I use that as an opportunity to encourage them to be reading their personal study guide and preparing for the Sunday lesson. And I'll turn and I'll say, and I appreciate it. I thank you for reading your lesson and meditating on it this week and being ready to help me teach this morning. So one is I am simply admitting that this is a difficult lesson. I need your help. But the second thing I'm attempting to do is reinforce this idea of studying that personal study guide before they come. Because what we want is informed discussion, not pooled ignorance. And so I'm saying to you, this is one of those lessons for me. It is a powerful lesson. It grips me. But there was some struggle I had in trying to find a way to convey the lesson. I hope the ideas are helpful to you, that you can take and use them for your benefit and your creativity. On the board, I have this question. What was this person famous for lying about? Now, I got that idea from the youth leader guide of Explore the Bible. And so I not only get a copy of the adult study guide, I get a copy of the youth study guide. Because sometimes they'll have such creative ideas that I can use those or adapt those to prepare my lesson. And do you know how valuable it is just to have an idea of how to get going on teaching a lesson? And so this comes from that. Now you recognize these names. Richard Nixon, of course, he was involved in the Watergate scandal. And there's Bernie Madoff, the largest Ponzi scheme in the United States history. He bilked $50 billion out of people. Lance Armstrong, 7 times winner of the Tour de France, and he said he had never used drug enhancing drugs. And of course that was proven wrong. But you may not know who Bill Lepp is. Well, Bill Lepp is the 5-time winner of the West Virginia Liars Contest. And you can go online and listen to some of his whopping tales. They're really quite hilarious. And it's a contest that they have nationally as well. These lies have consequences. And today we're looking at a time when Peter lied about who he was, and his lie led to sorrow and guilt. That's why our lesson summary statement says, denying Jesus leads to sorrow and guilt. Now, Jesus told Simon that he was going to be betrayed and he was going to die, and that Peter would declare that he never knew Jesus, even though Peter declared that he would die with Jesus. And then we see in this story that Peter does deny Jesus 3 times before the cock crows. Jesus predicts that. Now, the context of this lesson is at the end of this lesson, Jesus is being mocked and called upon to prophesy something. And what is unknown to the people who are mocking him is he has prophesied. And at that very moment, it's coming true in the life of Peter. This lesson takes us back to the same discussion that the disciples had in verse 23, and that's when Jesus told them that he was going to be betrayed, and they're asking one another if it was them. And so, who is it that's going to betray Jesus? Who is it that's going to deny Jesus? Well, it's the disciples, and it is you and me. And so this has that kind of power to this lesson. So how do we deny Jesus? Well, the first point of the lesson is distance. Distance. I would read the text and have someone read the text. And then I have this question. Who makes up this crowd? Who is it that makes up this company of people that Peter is with? Now you'll note that it's not the disciples that are there in Caiaphas's courtyard. It's some of the soldiers who went to arrest Jesus. It's some of the household of Caiaphas. They are obviously not followers of Jesus, and they're not in favor of Jesus. So the company that he's with are people who are anti-Jesus. So this is the crowd that he's with. And it says in this text, these are always interesting insights into the text. It says they lit a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, and Peter sat among them. In the springtime in Palestine, just like in much of our country, the mornings can be cool, and so they obviously lit the fire to be warm. Mark tells us that Peter drew near the fire to be warm. But Luke tells us they lit the fire, and what we see here is Peter is recognized. And so Peter is being revealed in this passage of Scripture. Peter has gotten comfortable with them. Now, how did Peter act when he was with the disciples? And I'd ask the class to that. And then how did he act when he's with this hostile crowd? And of course, the idea is denial. So what I'm trying to do in setting up this question is Peter acts one way when he's with one crowd, and Peter acts another way when he's with another crowd. And this seems to be a consistent issue with Peter. We find that happening when he is in Antioch or Damascus, and in the book of Acts where Paul has to confront him over his hypocrisy because of the crowd that came from Jerusalem. I want you to react to this statement. Who you are with shows you who you are not with. Listen to it again. Who you are with shows you who you are not with. How does that respond to that question? The crowd you run with may cause you to be distant with Jesus. So don't follow at a distance. It's not safe. So the first thing I'm trying to do is I'm just trying to talk about the influence of a crowd and how it can cause us to be distant. And we need to give consideration. Who are the people we are associating with? And is this group of people drawing us to Jesus or causing us to be distant from Jesus? The second thing that I want you to see out of this text are the circumstances. The circumstances can cause us to be reluctant to be identified with Jesus. For Peter, the circumstance was this crowd in which was opposed to Jesus. So what are the circumstances that many people face at work that would cause them to be hesitant to identify themselves with Jesus or to speak out about Jesus? I've had people come to me and tell me that their workplace is very politically correct, and there are things that they believe that they cannot speak of because it would be improper or unacceptable in the workplace. What about friends or social settings? What are the circumstances for our youth at school that would encourage them to be distant from Jesus instead of drawing them to Jesus? Or what about irreligious friends that people may have? The point I'm getting at is these two ideas. There's the crowd that has an influence on distancing us from Jesus, or it could be drawing us to Jesus. And then there are circumstances that we get in, and sometimes those intimidate us and cause us to be distant from Jesus. Let me mention 5 things that can create distance between us and Jesus, and we can talk about these as we go through them. These 5 things that can create distance between us and Jesus, I've posted on the board. just to talk through them, and the class asked the class to respond to them. One is an out-of-control schedule. Many people feel that today. We just run from one thing to the next thing. We don't have any margin. That's a popular word today. And as a result of that, we don't have time to spend in our Bibles, spend in prayer. Sometimes our schedule in coming to church is crowded out. And so sometimes an out-of-control schedule is something that distances us from Jesus. A second thing is misplaced affections. I think children's sports are great. I, as a child, participated in all the sports I could in my community. I enjoy going and watching my children and my grandchildren now play in sports. But sports become so important that it impinges on the things that are important, that are more important and more lasting. Sports has a great value to it, but not if it's taking us away from spending time with Jesus or spending time with the people of Jesus. So sometimes misplaced affections, discouragement. It's odd, isn't it? Discouragement should be something that would cause us to seek Jesus, move in the direction of Jesus. And yet how many discouraged believers have you known that their decision is to stay away from church and to not be with believers? It's the very opposite of what they should be doing. And the result is sorrow and guilt. Number 4 is abundance can cause us to be distanced from Jesus. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, Moses says to the children of Israel, when you get into the promised land, you're going to have houses that you didn't build. You're going to have fields of crops you didn't plant. You're going to have vineyards that are full and you didn't produce those vineyards. You're going to have an immediate wealth. And when you become wealthy, Moses said, you're going to forget God. So we are people who are tremendously blessed. We are the 1%ers of the world. In fact, we may be the 1/10 of 1%ers in the world. And our abundance is wonderful and we thank God for it. But sometimes our abundance can be a source of distancing us from Jesus. And guilt over sin. I know you've probably talked to people who, because of their guilt, they're reluctant to come to church. It's the very opposite, like with discouragement. It's the very place they should go and find forgiveness and reconciliation with God. But sometimes these are things that lead us to be distanced. And remember the outcome of distancing ourselves from Jesus? Sorrow and guilt. And so these are things we need to recognize, and instead of letting them distance us, whether it's the crowd or our circumstances or these 5 things that we've mentioned, we need to make the right decision and move in the direction of Jesus instead of being distanced from Jesus. The second point of our lesson is denial. Luke chapter 22, verses 56 through 60a. Now this is more serious. To deny is to claim that something is not true. To deny Jesus is to say that our words or thoughts or actions that we don't really believe the truth of who Jesus says He is or what He says He'll do. And so setting that up, that denial is claiming that something's not true. I want to read through the text and just make some comments about it. Verse 56, when a servant saw him sitting in the light and looked closely at him, she said, this man was with him too. But he denied it. Woman, I don't know him. He was sitting in the light. You cannot hide from God. Now the question was accusative. This man was with them. And when he uses the word woman, we know that he's talking to a slave girl. And from that perspective, it was easy to dismiss her accusation. I don't know him. And then it says, after a little while, someone else saw him and said, you're one of them too. And what is being stated here is they're asserting you are one of those disciples that followed after Jesus. And Peter says, man, I am not. His answer is more direct and more firm about his denial. About an hour later, another kept insisting. So you see, Peter had time to process this. He remembers, no doubt, that Jesus just a few hours ago said that you're going to deny me 3 times. Well, here's the second time. It's been an hour. He's had time to rethink this and to make a decision about what would be right. But an hour later, another kept insisting, this man was certainly with him, since he's also a Galilean. This assertion is more confident. It is grounded in evidence. And they point out that he's a Galilean. Now, that was a reference to his accent. It was different than the people of Judea. It may have something to do with his clothing, being different than people of Judea would wear, maybe even his manner. But he identified, just the way his demeanor was, identified him as a Galilean, and everyone knew Jesus was a Galilean. And it was also a put down. This was the country bumpkin people of their days, the way the people of Judea said it. This man was certainly with him, since he's also a Galilean. But Peter said, man, I don't know what you're talking about. Your accusations are ungrounded. So he's denying the truth. There are 3 ways in the Bible that it says we can deny Jesus. And I'd like to ask a class member to look up 1 John chapter 2, verse 22 to 23. 1 John chapter 2, verse 22 to 23. I'd like another member to look up Matthew chapter 10, verse 32 to 33. Matthew 10, verse 32 to 33. And then also Titus chapter 1, verse 6. So there's 3 ways that the Scriptures picture us denying Jesus. And when we look at each of these ways, I have 2 questions for you. How did Peter deny Jesus in the way that's described? And secondly, how is it done today? For example, 1 John chapter 2, verse 22 to 23, we deny Jesus, that Jesus is who he said he was. Denying that Jesus is who he said he was. Some will say of Jesus that he's a good moral teacher. It's stunning the number of Christians who believe that Jesus has sinned. That is saying about Jesus what is not true, and that is denying Jesus. So how did Peter do that? He said, I don't know the man. And then how is that done today? Like mentioning Jesus being a good moral teacher. A second way the Bible talks about us denying Jesus is not acknowledging Jesus before others. Not acknowledging Jesus before others. Mark chapter 10, verse 32 to 33. And so how did Peter do that? It's very obvious. 3 times he denied knowing Jesus. And in today, how do we do this today? Well, we confess he's Lord in our hearts, but we're slow to acknowledge him before others. There was a pastor that was saying that when he went to study at Cambridge, he knew that the temptation would be for him to slide into this mentality that is rejecting and looks down upon evangelical Christian faith. And he knew that that would be his temptation as well. And so he decided that the way that he would oppose that is on the very first time he met his instructor, the man that would supervise his studies, that within the first minute he would tell the man he was an evangelical Christian. He'd just get that out of the way. He knew that man would despise him because of that, but yet he would have that over with. So when he went to meet this instructor, this supervisor, he told him at the very beginning, he said, I am a fundamentalist Christian, and I'm going to be praying for you every day. And he said that just set the tone, that just made it out there, and it also put him under the gun in which to live the Christian faith. And sometimes we are slow to acknowledge our Christian faith before others. When I was in physical therapy school, the first day I showed up, I was late for class. Not my fault, I might add. And everybody in the class had already introduced themselves. And the teacher said to me, we've all introduced ourselves. Would you introduce yourself? I was a fairly new Christian at that time. I was very excited about Jesus. And I said to the class, there are 3 things you know about me. I'm married, and I love my wife, and I have a beautiful new baby. She's redheaded, and I am a follower of Jesus Christ. And I'm telling you, there was dead silence in that classroom. The professor felt a sense of awkwardness and said, she laughed nervously, and she said, well, I hope there'll be 4 things important to you, and that's physical therapy. And the class laughed. Later, people in that class would come up to me and quietly and on the sly, they would say, you're a Christian? Well, they knew I was a Christian. I made it pretty clear in class. And they said, well, I'm a Christian as well. And apparently I had broke the ice in that way. So not acknowledging Jesus before others. There's a third way in which we deny Jesus according to the Bible, and that is hypocrisy. Titus chapter 1, verse 6. So what is the hypocrisy in Peter's life? The class could talk about that. And then for us, it's just simply examining our life. Does your life match your profession? So there is the denial. This is one of the ways that we deny Jesus. We claim something that's not true about Jesus or about ourselves and our relationship with Jesus. And again, one of the things I'm wanting to keep drawing the class to is this kind of decision, this kind of action leads to sorrow and guilt. There's no other place that it can go to. And so we just need to be honest about our relationship with Christ and avoid the sorrow and the guilt. Now, the third point is defeat. Denying Jesus leads to sorrow and guilt. Luke chapter 22, verse 60b to verse 62. This is an epic failure. All 4 Gospels report this story. He denied Jesus in the presence of Jesus. There's something about Peter's defeat that every gospel writer finds so powerful that it must be included in their story. They must tell it one more time. So let's see what it says in Luke's Gospel, verse 60. Immediately while he was still speaking, a rooster crowed. The way Luke writes it, he's talking about the animal. You'll find some discussion on, it may have been the Roman centurion's changing of the guard. It was called the rooster crowing. It was at midnight and it was at 3:00. But according to the way commentaries say Luke writes it, he's referring to the animal. Verse 61, then the Lord turned and looked at Peter. This is a detail that Luke includes that the other writers don't include. Peter couldn't hide from Jesus. Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. He suddenly had a remembrance. And then verse 62, and he went outside and wept bitterly. The phrase wept bitterly is referred to grief over someone who has died. What Luke is telling us is that Peter was shattered. He was dying on the inside on what had happened here. Now, your Leader's Guide commentary says of this phrase, Jesus looked at Peter. It says the term looked conveys the idea of looking directly and intently. Though more than a glance, Jesus' look was not characterized as a glare or a scowl. His eyes likely conveyed more sadness than accusation. And some of the things that you may read will talk about what did Peter see when he looked at Jesus. And some say, well, he didn't see in Jesus' eyes gloating. I told you so. That wouldn't be true to the nature of Jesus. Jesus was heartbroken over Peter's failure. He wouldn't see anger because it says of Jesus that he wouldn't break a bruised reed or snuff out a flickering flame. He was gentle, Jesus. He wouldn't have said How could you do this to me, Peter? There wouldn't be this hurt. Jesus didn't come to add burdens to us. He came to take the guilt away. What Peter saw in Jesus that may have been even more convicting than anything is he saw nothing but the pure, holy love of Jesus. And this was hard for him to see. But if he had kept looking, he would have seen Jesus' forgiveness, his acceptance, his cleansing, and his forever giving love. What was it that Peter saw when he looked at Jesus? Now, Jesus sought Peter out. He restores him after the resurrection. So we know how the rest of this story goes. And what I think would be interesting to discuss in class is how did this colossal defeat of Peter, how did this change him? When you think about the rest of Peter's life, how did this crushing moment of exposure to Jesus, this deep, deep grief over how he has denied his Lord, how did that change Peter? You may want to just take time and just scan through 1 Peter or even 2 Peter. And in light of this event, you can see Peter reflecting that over and over in those passages. He talks about submitting yourself under the mighty hand of God. And he talks about suffering submissively. You can see that all through the writings of Simon Peter. The way I want to conclude the lesson is, this is a statement that's made in a sermon on the Lutheran Hour. And the speaker is telling about a coach of his child, a baseball coach. And he noticed that this baseball coach had this real fire in his eyes, but it wasn't necessarily over baseball. He came to understand it was over relationships. The coach told a story about a time when his son was pitching and his son was not doing well, and he walked several players and they scored a run and the team lost. And the coach just let his son have it because of that. But he finally came to his senses, and he was so terribly ashamed of what he had said and done towards his son. But that defeat helped him to step back and see, what is the purpose of sports? What's the purpose of coaching? And this is what the coach said. Sports matter because they give us an opportunity to use challenges and obstacles to help us grow into better people. And that makes the defeats as important, if not more important, than the victories. I think that's fantastic. Think about that. That makes the defeats as important, if not more important, than the victories. How many sports stories do you know of an athlete who had a crushing defeat, but that great defeat is what was used to build something in him to make him the great champion he was? How many sports teams had crushing defeats, and yet the coach will say that defeat is what made us into the team that we are today. And this is what this coach is saying. And what I'm saying to you is we've all denied Jesus. And we've known what Peter knew about this defeat, this weeping bitterly. But Jesus is great enough to use those things to make us better than we are and more like Him. So I'd like for the class to discuss this question as we close out the lesson. Final thing to say to you is, in some of your studies you may come across discussions about the differences in the narratives of Peter's denial. There's an article that you can find at Gospel Coalition by Craig Bloomberg. It's entitled, You Asked, Are the Differing Narratives of Peter's Denial Reconcilable? And it's a very clear and simple explanation about what's going on in the differences that you find in these narratives. That just would be helpful to you if you think that someone may be asking you about that. God bless you. Thank you for watching.